And it's loading. And we are live.
Good evening. I'm Scott Harris, Executive Director of Museums at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program this evening by one of our institutions, the James Monroe Museum. And the program is Mourning, Mania, the Tombs of Washington and Monroe, presented by Dr. Matthew Costello of the White House Historical Association. Before I introduce our guest, I want to thank the sponsors that make possible all of the public programs that are presented annually by the James Monroe Museum. These include Fredericksburg Savings Charitable Trust, the Paul and Jane Jones Trust, administered by our friend Walter J. Sheffield, the Stuart Jones Charitable Trust, and the Friends of the James Monroe Museum. We're very grateful for the support of all these folks. I also remind our audience, as we have in the age of COVID, that on Facebook, as you are watching this on Facebook Live, you may submit questions for our actually two speakers tonight. I'll mention the other one in a moment. Throughout the conversation in the comments section to the right of your screen. And Lindsay Crawford, who is our public programs coordinator, will get to as many of these as she can, feed them to me, and then I will pose them to our speakers. We promise to get to as many as possible in the time we have, so we do ask you to be succinct and on topic, and that you pose questions, not necessarily utter comments that you want to get across, but we're really looking for questions for our speakers. At the end of Matt Costello's presentation, the James Monroe Museum's Assistant Director and Curator, Jared Kearney, will go over some of the items in the museum's collection that pertain to James Monroe's death and burial. And now to our guest, who might look familiar to anyone who's been watching our programming lately, because he was just on not long ago with a colleague from the White House Historical Association talking about the Slavery in the President's Neighborhood research initiative that the association is doing. Dr. Matthew Costello is Vice President of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History and Senior Historian for the White House Historical Association. He joined the association in 2016 after completing his PhD and MA in American History at Marquette University. His first book, The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, and the Memory of the First President, was published by the University Press of Kansas in 2019, and appropriately was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. He is currently editing essays for a volume entitled Mourning the Presidents, which will be published by the University of Virginia Press, and working on a book for the association on the Theodore Roosevelt White House. Matt also teaches an undergraduate course on White House history at American University. So it's a pleasure to welcome back Matt Costello.
Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. It's great to be back with you, and kudos to the James Monroe Museum. I was very excited to see the C-SPAN rankings and to see President Monroe has moved up to 12. So you're getting there. I know your work isn't going to be over until he's number one. But well done, and it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about my book, but then also the parallels between Washington and James Monroe in terms of remembrance and burials. So with that, I'd like to start our lecture this evening with a presentation that I will be giving. And the first part of my talk really relates more about the subject of my book, The Property of the Nation. Next slide, please. So this story really begins where George Washington's ends. Washington passed away at Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799. He had been attended to by 3 different doctors. Unfortunately, none of the medical treatments of the day or anything that they performed were enough to save him. He likely died of acute epiglottitis, whether it was bacterial or viral, we're not really sure. But it was a pretty quick and likely a painful death for George Washington. And after he died, his family set off to prepare the proper funeral arrangements for Washington. He was buried at Mount Vernon in the Old Tomb on December 18th, 1799. But even before then, there were additional precautions taken. For example, Washington had informed his family that he wanted to be laid out for a couple of days before he was buried. And of course, this speaks to the very real fear that people in the 18th century had of being buried alive. They wanted to make sure that they were truly dead before they were buried. And so Washington was laid out in the new room, and this is where the measurements would have been taken for his grave clothes. It's where the family would have viewed the body, and they would have prepared him for burial on the 18th. But after Washington is gone, the question really becomes, well, who will be the guardian of his legacy? Who will control his memory? And there were multiple efforts throughout the 19th century to take on that role, to commandeer Washington's image, and they were done through the attempted acquisition of his physical remains. Next slide. Now, it wasn't just these different political parties, factions, governments, whether it was the state of Virginia or the federal government, vying for control of Washington's physical remains, but also American citizens. They literally wanted a piece of George Washington. This image is actually a picture of a locket at Mount Vernon that has some of Washington's hair in it. Now, you might be thinking this seems a little bit odd, but in the 19th century, this was actually quite common to cut some of the hair of the deceased, and you would make it and insert it into mourning jewelry. So whether it was rings or pendants or pins, necklaces, this would be a way to show that you were commemorating a deceased family member, you were remembering them. And of course, with George Washington, the father of his country, this was considered valuable hair. In fact, I found a number of letters of people writing Martha Washington at Mount Vernon asking for different things that belonged to her husband. One man wanted one of his suits because he wanted to do a portrait and he wanted his model to have the proper attire. And there was a group of women who also requested a lock of George Washington's hair, and they said that their father served with Washington in the American Revolution. And that one turned out that Martha did acquiesce, and she did send a lock of hair to this group of women. Next slide. But beyond the actual physical pieces of George Washington, the larger question was, well, how do we properly commemorate who was probably arguably the most significant leader of the new nation, certainly steering the country through the American Revolution as commander-in-chief, but then also the man who became the first president of the United States, set many precedents within that office, really formed and shaped that institution. How do we properly commemorate that person? Now, Federalists had a very different idea from Democratic Republicans. Federalists really pushed for the lionization of George Washington. They suggested, this is actually a design that was done by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, the very famous English architect, to essentially create a mausoleum of pyramidal proportions in Washington, D.C. that would house the remains of George Washington. Now, one of the major reasons Democratic Republicans pushed back against this is because they didn't believe, after fighting the American Revolution, that any one man should be commemorated in such a way. They make the point that Washington was not a pharaoh, he was not a king, he was not an emperor, so none of these places of repose are really suitable, especially for someone who led the country to become a republic. So there's a conflict between these two parties, which very much echoes their differing political beliefs in the 1790s, but also keep in mind that this is really on the cusp of the election of 1800, where Federalists will lose more seats in Congress, Democratic Republicans will take control, and Jefferson will also win the presidency, and really hero worship changes from that point forward. But it is worth noting that in December 1799, when Washington had only died, he died on December 14th, only 10 days later, President John Adams had actually sent a letter to Martha Washington requesting that in the future, when the Capitol was finished, that George Washington be entombed beneath the rotunda. And if you've ever been to the Capitol, you've probably seen the crypt, and the space for Washington's tomb is actually directly below that. Next slide. Now, between 1799, there was that initial push to have Washington moved, and Martha Washington actually agrees to it. But keep in mind, the Capitol is not completed. The rotunda won't be completed until later in the 1820s. But in between, we have the War of 1812, we have the burning of the Capitol, And there's a very real concern that any attempt to move Washington's remains to the United States Capitol could result in desecration, ransacking. So as a result, the state of Virginia actually proposes to build a monument in 1816 and move George Washington's body from Mount Vernon to be entombed beneath that monument in Richmond, Virginia. The owner of Mount Vernon at that time is Supreme Court Justice Bushrod Washington, who is the nephew of George Washington, and he declines the application, stating that George Washington wished to be buried at Mount Vernon in his will. So he leaves it as in accordance with his uncle's will. There is some evidence to suggest that there was some sort of attempted grave robbing at Mount Vernon in 1830. Now, exactly who perpetrated it, it's not very clear. It may have been a former employee. It may have just been a passerby, but someone did attempt to remove Washington's body. They're unsuccessful. And as a result, the Washington family builds a new tomb at Mount Vernon. This is part of the reason why when you go to Mount Vernon today, there is an old tomb and a new tomb. And I think it's probably pretty self-explanatory which one is which. But the new tomb was built in 1830, 1831 to house Washington's remains and the remains of about 20 to 25 other family members. This is an engraving of what is today the new tomb. It looks quite different. That's because throughout the 1830s, additional work was done on the tomb. It was encased in brick, and then later, in the front of it, that's where the Victorian Gothic arch of brick was added, and that's where the two marble sarcophagi for George and Martha Washington were put. So what you're actually looking at is sort of the face of the tomb if you were to peer into the enclosure today. Next slide. Now, why this fascination with George Washington's body? Well, as Americans were becoming more cognizant of their history, more appreciative and interested in their history, I mean, really, this is sort of our origin story. More people were drawn to Mount Vernon, and as a result, there was a booming tourism industry of people coming to Mount Vernon. Now, the problem with that was that Mount Vernon was still a privately owned estate and plantation. And so Washington's relatives who owned the house really did not like people trespassing all the time and knocking on their door, asking if they had any fun stories about George Washington, or asking if they could see where he died in the house. So essentially, access to the house is shut off unless you have a letter of introduction or you know the Washington family personally. So if you can't go inside the house, what is the other major attraction on the grounds? Well, it's the tomb. And so steamboat companies actually start running service in the 1850s down to Mount Vernon. And this is one of the advertisements that you would have seen, the Thomas Collier running service down between Washington, Alexandria, and then down to Mount Vernon. And of course, the primary attraction is going to be on the handbill. It's to see the tomb of Washington. Next slide. And if you were lucky enough to get down there, you might be able to break off a piece of a tree, turn it into a walking stick, or maybe pull some of the leaves or branches or stones. In fact, I found many accounts of people doing this. They describe themselves as pilgrims, removing relics from Mount Vernon. But to the Washington family, these were trespassers and they were vandalizing. And so if you couldn't make it to Mount Vernon, there was an alternative. There was actually a man in Washington, D.C. named James Crutchett who acquired a fair amount of lumber and wood from the Mount Vernon estate. And he built and crafted souvenir pieces. So this is one such example. It's a medallion. And of course, what is the imprint within the medallion? It's the tomb of Washington. Next slide. Now, if you're going to buy something not from Mount Vernon, but from somebody who says they have materials from Mount Vernon, you're going to need a certificate of authenticity. And so this is what this is. You would get one of these, the Mount Vernon gem, for example, and there is a statement on there from John Augustine Washington. This was John Augustine Washington III, the last private owner of Mount Vernon, and he certifies that he has sold under contract to James Crutchett a portion of the wood from the same hill that the tomb and mansion of Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, reside. And it is true, it was a portion, but when I did the research, it turns out it was a very small portion. In fact, a lot of the wood came from other parts of the estate. Next slide. So who was actually interacting with all these visitors? Who was talking to people, sharing stories? and in a way, weaving themselves into the stories and then also profiting from these experiences, because I kept finding instances where people were giving gratuities and tips, and it was primarily to the enslaved workers at Mount Vernon. Now, keep in mind, after Washington dies, he frees those that he owns outright in his own right, but Martha does not in terms of the Custis estate. But when Bushrod Washington comes, he brings a new enslaved community with him. So there is mixing between these different groups. Obviously, there's going to be some sharing of stories and oral histories, but eventually some of these stories find their way forward even to the 1840s and 1850s, where there are enslaved people talking about knowing Washington, seeing Washington, experiencing Washington. And it seems much more likely that they have, in some ways, formed a script. And they are telling people these stories. They are selling items to tourists. Next slide. For example, one of the most mentioned instances is these Washington canes, which not only could people buy from people like James Crutchett in Washington, D.C. with wood that was taken from the estate, but that there were enslaved people at Mount Vernon telling stories and selling Washington canes as well. Now, these were always said to have been pulled from trees near Washington's tomb. They were cut down and shaped so that someone would have not only a memento of their trip, but also it would be a symbol of respectability, of 19th century affluence. And you could see with this cover of a musical score sheet, Washington's Tomb Ballad, you have what looks like an African-American man sitting next to the entrance of the tomb, and there are a number of walking sticks propped up next to him. Next slide. So within that enclosure, of course, we have George Washington's sarcophagus. So the last time he had been moved was in 1837, and that's when a marble mason from Philadelphia named John Struthers delivers this marble sarcophagus to Mount Vernon. So Washington was moved at that time from the inner vault of the new tomb into this enclosure. It was sealed. And what's really interesting even with this is that there are some people who then later say that they were witnesses. There are stories about Washington floating in alcohol or floating in some type of preserving liquids. There are other mentions of that he was still perfectly formed, almost like a Catholic version of the incorruptible. There's a gentleman who passes away, I think in the 1910s, it might have been 1912, and he claims that he is the last living person to see George Washington, his face, when he was moved. He said that there was only a dark spot on his cheek. So what do these types of stories tell us? Well, that, when it comes to things like bodily remains, that there's a lot more to unpack in terms of when are people moved, why are they moved, and then why do people carry these stories forward into the future? And for me, it seems like we're constantly finding instances where these individuals are trying to weave themselves into the wider story of Washington's legacy, his importance, his significance. But more often than not, these stories are a little bit far-fetched, and there really isn't any other evidence to support some of these stories. Next slide. Now today, the Guardians of Mount Vernon, it's really the only entity that was able to successfully intervene and save Mount Vernon, save the tomb from falling into total disrepair. And that is the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, led by this woman, Anne Pamela Cunningham. Originally from South Carolina, she took it upon herself and a group of women to raise the necessary funds to purchase Mount Vernon as a private entity from John Augustine Washington III. Throughout the 1850s, there were rumors constantly in the newspapers. And what's really fascinating is what these rumors tell us about the fears that Americans had about losing Washington. That's what they always say. There's a rumor that there are foreigners who are interested in purchasing Mount Vernon and that they're going to charge Americans to go visit Mount Vernon. There's another rumor that, as you can imagine, this makes total sense because there is a nativism influence in wave in the United States in the early 1850s. There's fears that Jewish businessmen will, they'll purchase Mount Vernon and they'll charge a premium. There's also worries that other foreigners, Germans, Irish, Swiss, that they will decide to make the home of America's father into an amusement park. And so this urgency to save Mount Vernon, save it for Americans, however you want to define that, but also save it for preservation's sake, it really reaches a crescendo in 1858. And that's when, after negotiating their charters with both the Virginia General Assembly and also privately corresponding with John Augustine Washington III, the Ladies Association is able to enter into its agreement with John Augustine Washington III, and they formally take possession of Mount Vernon in 1860, literally on the eve of the American Civil War. Next slide. And throughout the Civil War, obviously it was very important to maintain neutrality. Anne Pamela Cunningham is trapped behind enemy lines back in South Carolina. She won't venture north for the rest of the war. So she leaves Sarah Tracy of New York, one of her secretaries, to essentially run operations of Mount Vernon while she is south. And paired with her is the first superintendent of Mount Vernon, a Virginian man named Upton Herbert. And so even there you have a New Yorker and a Virginian, which I thought was a nice pairing because we're going to talk about that shortly with James Monroe. And even during this time, there were soldiers that were visiting. Now, these were primarily Union soldiers. And in fact, if you go to Mount Vernon today and you get close enough to the face of the tomb and you look very carefully, what you'll see is that a number of these soldiers carved their initials or the names of their regiments directly into the brick face. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that graffiti is also a means of demonstrating that you're claiming something. You're quite literally leaving your mark on something. And so to us, what might seem almost sacrilegious, to carve your initials onto the face of somebody's tomb enclosure, to 19th century Americans, especially many of the Northerners who were fighting a civil war against the side that had also claimed George Washington, they were literally leaving their mark on the Washington that they were fighting to uphold. The Union that Washington had founded, the Constitution that he had presided over and upheld as the first president of the United States, they were quite literally claiming Washington for the Union. Next slide. So this, in summation of the story of Washington, and for anybody out there who hasn't been to Mount Vernon, ultimately, Washington doesn't leave Mount Vernon. In fact, that's actually part of the contract that the ladies negotiate with John Augustine Washington III, is that they are not only purchasing the house and 200 acres of the estate, but they're also purchasing all of the outlying buildings and the tomb. The tomb is specifically mentioned in that agreement. And even though there were multiple attempts, 1799, 1816, probably the most famous attempt was in 1832, because by then the rotunda is finished. It's the centennial of George Washington's birth. And this becomes a flashpoint. And of course, in 1832, there's a number of other things swirling around Congress in terms of sectionalism, politics. That one also fails. But this idea of looking back on the founders and claiming them, it wasn't just a phenomenon that happened to George Washington. In fact, there were a number of founders who at various different points in time, there was some debate or dialogue about where they should be buried, how they should be commemorated, what types of mausoleums or monuments or memorials should represent them. And that, of course, then leaves us with James Monroe. James Monroe, even though he was born in Virginia, died in New York, his story is an example of a successful removal and reinterment. And it was, even though it never successfully happened for George Washington, it did for James Monroe. So how does this come about? On July 4th, 1831, James Monroe dies in New York at the home of his son-in-law and daughter, 63 Prince Street. You can see it on the right side. That is a later photograph. Unfortunately, the house does not survive. It goes through a number of different uses. There are a number of different fires, but then it also collapses in 1925 when they're trying to actually move it for preservation purposes. So the house no longer exists today. But Monroe had gone to live with his son-in-law and daughter after the death of his wife. He had been in poor health for most of 1831. and he likely died of tuberculosis. And so, of course, July 4th, he's the third president to die on the 4th of July, joining John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The funeral was held on July 7th, 1831. Next slide. And this gives you an idea, sort of the geography of what transpired. And I also included this very interesting death mask that was created by John Henry Isaac Brower. And he did a number of death masks for a number of famous people, but he did this one for James Monroe. So Monroe dies at 63 Prince Street. That is that first circle closer to the number 14. And after private family services, Monroe his bodily remains are moved from his residence on Prince Street down to City Hall. That's the large circle with the two other buildings at the bottom, where they were held for an address by William Dewar, who was the president of Columbia College at that time. Then on to St. Paul's Church, where a funeral service was held. The procession then turns, and you can see the two lines on Broadway. It then heads north up Broadway to Bleecker Street, through Bleecker to the Bowery, up Bowery to 2nd Street, and then to the New York Marble Cemetery. That is the first circle. And then you'll see a second circle to the right, and that is the New York City Marble Cemetery. So Monroe was actually technically buried, entombed in two different places in New York. And I want to give special thanks to Scott Harris and Heidi Stella for their assistance with this research. Monroe, it appears, was only very briefly entombed in a temporary vault in the first cemetery on the left, and then he was moved to the second cemetery, the New York City Marble Cemetery on the right, and that is where his body remained for the next roughly 27 years. Next slide. So in 1858. So why is that year significant? Well, yes, we are getting closer and closer to the Civil War, but also 1858 is the centennial of James Monroe's birth. He was born in 1758. So again, very similar to Washington's example. Washington's was 1732. And then, of course, there was the attempt to try to move Washington's body in 1832. And in 1858, it's successful to move Monroe's body and entomb him in the President's Circle at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. And now this first image you're looking at, this is actually from a July 17th, 1858 issue of Harper's Weekly, which included a number of illustrations related to the moving of Monroe's body in New York, the funeral arrangements that were done there, and then the ceremonies and entombment at Hollywood Cemetery. So according to the contemporary accounts at that time, and also the New York City Marble Cemetery records, Monroe's remains were removed from that cemetery on July 2nd. They were conveyed to the Church of the Annunciation, and then in a procession to the City Hall, where they laid in state. According to one newspaper, the corpse was laid in state at the governor's room. Next slide. Now on July 3rd, Monroe's remains were removed from City Hall and taken to the steamship Jamestown, very affectionately named Jamestown, to convey James Monroe back to his native state of Virginia. There is I found some discrepancies. Some say that the remains arrived back in Richmond late in the evening of July 4th. Some say in the early morning hours of July 5th. I think it's July 5th is probably accurate. And July 5th was then the day that the city of Richmond turned out to celebrate James Monroe and bury him at Hollywood Cemetery. Next slide. And here, of course, is the ceremony at Hollywood Cemetery, which is in the southeast corner of the cemetery today. And I did pull out a couple of interesting quotes from the newspapers of the day, the Richmond Enquirer, that talk about this event. This one from the Richmond Dispatch, July 7th, 1858, says, "On no previous occasion, not excepting even the 22nd of February last, has such a vast throng of humanity been visible on Main Street." And of course, they're referencing the last birthday celebration of George Washington, which was an annual event. It was the 4th of July and Washington's birthday, February 22nd. Now, Governor Henry Wise gave an oration at the funeral and at the entombment ceremonies at Hollywood Cemetery. And one of the things he mentioned, and I just want to quote him, he says, "Virginia was the natural mother of Monroe, and New York was his mother-in-law. Virginian by birth and baptism, New York by marriage and burial. Virginia respectfully allowed his ashes to lie long enough to consecrate her sister's soil, and now has dutifully taken them to be earth to earth and ashes to her ashes, at home in the land of his cradle." And what's really interesting about this is that I found very similar rhetoric anytime the Virginians were arguing to defend Washington, to keep him in Virginia, especially when there were these attempts to move Washington's body to Washington, D.C. They would talk about how Washington belonged to Virginia. Washington was a native son. Washington's blood had been spilled with the blood of their fathers to fight for the revolution, to fight for freedom. And so this rhetoric is still very much being used, even in the 1850s. And a big part of it is because Americans are seeing themselves much more divided and much more in terms of sections and states versus a united nation. Next slide. So I included 3 different images of the James Monroe tomb if you were to go see it at different points in time. The image on the right is the most recent version of it after the 2015 restoration of the tomb. Now, the tomb itself, this is actually, it's cast iron, this enclosure, and it surrounds the granite sarcophagus of James Monroe. It very much features the Gothic revival style, and it resembles almost like a cathedral, but it was actually made of cast iron, which is, it probably doesn't seem that way when you look at the image on the right. That almost has the appearance of mimicking stone. Well, that's how it was designed, and that's why it was created that way. And it was erected in 1859, so a year after Monroe was moved. It was designed by a German-born architect named Albert Liebrock, and it was made in Philadelphia at a cost of $1,682. Now, in 2015, a $1 million restoration project was begun by the Virginia Department of General Services, working with a team of conservators, fabricators, and contractors. And I know Jared is going to show us a little bit of the cast iron pieces in the collection, and I'm sure he can talk more about that. But with these images, also just to understand that, over time, coats and coats of paint were added. So when the restoration work was done, extensive paint analysis needed to be done to just see what were the different layers, when were they applied, and also how often were they applied. And you could see from these 3 different versions that for quite a while, it was almost like a brownish chocolate color. Eventually, they started to paint it black. But with this restoration work in 2015, these layers were removed. There were a number of improvements done upon it, including the fasteners. There's about 2,500 of them holding that bird cage together, the bird cage as they call it, and those needed to be replaced. So that is what you see today if you go to Hollywood Cemetery to visit the grave of James Monroe. And the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Jared is that it's very interesting. There's a lot of parallels between Washington and Monroe. The age that they grew up in, their socioeconomic status, their political rise, their military service, their service in government, the fact that they were both born in Virginia, but except Washington died in Virginia, and that's where he was buried, and Monroe didn't. So, what does this removal of Monroe's remains tell us about America in 1858? Well, as Americans were becoming more cognizant of their history, they were also coming to see it very differently, depending on which political party you asked, which faction you asked, which state you asked, and they were becoming much more possessive and defensive of their history and their heroes. And in this particular instance, quite literally possessive of the physical remains of one of Virginia's most popular and significant heroes, James Monroe. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jared.
Well, Thank you so much, Dr. Stella. That was incredible. That was truly amazing. I am just going to really quickly just show you a few of the items that we have here at the museum that sort of that gives some accent to Dr. Costello's wonderful talk there. And so the first thing that I want to show you is, and I'm going to do a screen share here, if I may. Okay, if we can go photo, and I'm going to find it. Okay. So hopefully you can see that. So this is the viewing of James Monroe's coffin, and we actually had this painting here at the museum. And as you saw, from the talk, with the engraving that was in Leslie's illustrated newspaper. Well, and Samuel Gouverneur Jr., James Monroe's grandson, he was serving in Fuzhou at the time. At the time, it was called Fuzhou, as an American consul, and he was unable to attend the state viewing in New York City Hall. So he actually commissioned this painting, and it's based on that illustration from the Leslie's illustrated newspaper, that engraving. And he actually had himself painted into it. If you look closely, he's the man at the black suit at the head of a coffin. So you could see that he's actually had this commission while he was in China, and he had it done. He actually had himself inserted into the painting. And I'm going to actually show you the painting here. This is the actual painting that we have that was commissioned by James Monroe's grandson while he was over in China. So that's kind of an interesting little sort of side note there. And also, I wanted to show you a couple things here. The first thing I'm going to show you is I want to show you the actual eulogy of the life and character of James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States, delivered by the request of the coronation of the city of Boston by none other than John Quincy Adams. So I'm going to show you this here. This is the actual document here. This is an actual copy of the eulogy that he did. And this was at the 25th of August in 1831. So this was in Boston. And I'm just going to really quickly read you the last paragraph, the last thing he says here. It's really quite beautiful. He says this about James Monroe. He says, "And should the gloom of the year of independence ever again overspread the sky, or the metropolis of your empire be once more destined to smart under the scourge of an invader's hand, that there never be found wanting among the children of your country a warrior to bleed, the statesman to counsel, a chief to direct and govern, inspired with all the virtues, endowed with all the faculties which have been so significantly displayed in the life of James Monroe." So that is quite a thing to say. I know, and Dr. Costello was talking about hero worship and all that sort of thing. Well, that certainly is some flowery language there, but quite eloquent, I must say. And when he's talking about bleed, he actually means that quite literally, because James Monroe was shot at the Battle of Trenton and embedded with a bullet in his shoulder that remained with him his entire life. So when he's saying a warrior to bleed, he means that quite literally in this case. So it's kind of interesting. I also wanted to show you, this is an actual original book here. And so I'll see if I can open it up here for you to see a little bit better. This is published by Rudolfo Wolf. And this is this is regarding the removal of the remains of James Monroe. So this is a copy of that book that was published in 1858, and it's published in New York. And so it actually describes in some detail the removal of the remains of James Monroe. And so it was a whole thing. It was quite an ordeal, enough to actually write a book about it, as you can see. And there's actually a part in here that I'll read, and again, super quick, but regarding some hero worship there. He says, "His rule shone out upon the country like the calm, soft rays of an autumnal sun." And so it's kind of an interesting little piece there. Okay, so the final thing that I want to show you is, we were talking about the tomb of James Monroe down in Richmond, and they called it the bird cage. Well, as Dr. Costello was saying, that it was quite an ordeal. It's quite ornate, and it was actually designed by Albert Leibrock. He was the German-born architect, and who was actually buried a short distance from Monroe in Hollywood Cemetery. Well, it was something that's interesting. You know, over 150 years, you know, there's going to be all kinds of degradation. And so in 2015, the state actually decided, and I actually have here, I'm going to show you some pieces here. Let's see, Monroe Tomb fragments. The Department of General Services, they actually gave $900,000 to restore what they call the birdcage, you know, James Monroe's tomb. And so, well, why was that necessary? Well, you know, over the years, even as well made as it was definitely deteriorating. At that point, you know, it was black. It was really dark, really gothic looking, something you know, out of a Batman movie maybe. But you know, as they did some restoration, I was conversing with Scott Kim, who's one of the project managers there, and at Chase Architectural Metals, and this was back in 2015, 2016. Back then, they actually had pieces of the tomb that they had taken off and were replacing. It was a complete overhaul. So the last thing I'll show you here is real quick. I want to show you, see if I can hold this up. This is an actual piece of the original Monroe tomb that we have here. And you want to talk about restoration and why it was necessary. Well, if you can see that, that is a good example of why the restoration happens. And it turned out that they did a beautiful, wonderful job. And you can actually go see Monroes Tube, and no longer looks like this. So you can actually go see the Monroes Tube today in this wonderful restoration, and it back to its beige color, which it was originally, and in all its glory. So there you have it, a fragment of James Monroe Tomb and what the deterioration that was actually going on at the time. So with that, I will lead this now to question and answer with Scott Harris.
Thank you both, Matt Costello and Jared Kearney, for painting the pictures that you did of the fascination, the hero worship of our first president and our fifth. And as Matt noted, there are a number of parallels or similarities, I think conscious and unconscious, between Washington and Monroe. Monroe probably wouldn't have openly admitted to it, but he did emulate Washington in a number of ways, despite the fact that they became politically estranged as their careers advanced. And yet I do think there was a very much an element of respect and desire to emulate and to earn some of the same regard that Washington had from so many of the people, particularly after death. Washington got his own share of criticism during his administration as president, no question. In fact, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the earliest known political cartoons kind of lampoons Washington, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe that's right, yes.
Yeah,
and just to add to that, I mean, you know, I was recently reading Peter Enriquez has a new book on Washington, and he has an entire chapter in that book where he looks at sort of the falling out of friendships, you know, between Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. It was almost like, you know, Washington in one point in his life was very close and allies with all these Virginian politicians. And by the end of his presidency, it seems like he sees himself as very different from them, which is funny because they see themselves as very similar to him.
So I'm starting to filter through the questions here, and we do encourage them. Please, you do utilize the chat feature or the comment feature, excuse me, and I'll try to sift through these. One question, well, or let me just mention too, and Matt alluded to it near the end, the circumstances of Monroe's death and burial in New York are interesting. We've been learning more about it lately, in some ways rediscovering information. And the next issue of the James Monroe Museum e-newsletter, which will come out tomorrow, has a story that's been put together about that talks about the two New York burials of James Monroe. It's part one of a two-parter. Second part will address some of what Matt talked about, with the effort to bring him back to Virginia. One question that is here that sort of relates to that is, if I can get the mouse to come back on my, do we know if the graves of Adams or Jefferson, and to a degree, I guess referring to Monroe and Hollywood Cemetery, received similar tourism and public promotion to that of Washington?
I mean, to the same degree, I would think probably, well, there's a number of things sort of playing into this. I think first, Mount Vernon's proximity to Washington, D.C., that certainly plays a role in it, that, people can take omnibuses, carriages, they can come by horse, they can take steamboats. I mean, there's many different ways for people to reach Mount Vernon from what would become, a major city in the 19th century. I don't think that necessarily is the case with many of the other founders. Many of them are either buried in churches or they're buried on their private estates. Many of these estates stay in possession of the family. So that's one of the things that's working against it. Washington remains very popular in the 19th century because he kind of checks everybody's boxes. Everybody can claim some part of him. The Freemasons can claim him. Virginians can claim him. Southerners can claim him. Northerners can claim him. Constitutionalists can claim him. There's a malleability about Washington that everybody can seem to pick one part of him, and that they say that's the part that we should know about Washington. And I think it's a lot harder with a lot of the other early presidents to do that. With visitors and people coming, I know Monticello experienced a lot of this with Jefferson. But I think all the founders had this to some degree. I just don't think, probably not to the same intensity or level as Washington.
Well, and Washington never had to run in comparison to the guy before him.
True.
And also was setting a precedent with everything that he did. And no matter how much he gets reassessed, I think Washington just occupies that utterly unique position among the chief executives. And as you say, everyone could find a way to claim him. He could be vilified and venerated in practically the same breath. And it's just a fascinating place for him to be, being first. And knowing everything he did was going to be scrutinized and be followed. And I think that, Adams is coming in with a lot more baggage about his reputation, about how he's perceived, a lot more insecurity in some respects, and yet a lot more arrogance. Jefferson is rather indifferent to it all. Madison is very studious and not as colorful. And then Monroe is there to close out the Virginia dynasty, at least, and again is echoing Washington to a certain degree. So yeah, within those first five, I think it's interesting to see how these things work with them. You mentioned, in fact, I'd started to write the question and you actually addressed it, about all the memorabilia that started to get generated commemorating Washington. Immediately made me think, okay, was there a business in fakes? And you address that. And pieces of the True Cross, holy relics, really suggest themselves with this. Was there any, did anyone worry that Washington was being set up too much as an idol? Was there some conflict between this veneration of him and what was a very religious society at that time?
Well, it's really interesting because a lot of the visitors, they will describe, and I think a part of it is because they just don't have that language yet. They don't think of these things as, they're not going on a vacation to get, and they don't get souvenirs. They use languages that I think suggest that there is something a little bit more pseudo-sacred about it. They'll describe going on a pilgrimage and that they are pilgrims collecting relics. And it's not that I think that they thought that these were, sacred or religious, but they must have, there was a significance to them. There was a weight to them. And that's why they use that type of terminology, that they were literally holding a piece of Washington's world, whether it's a piece of his coffin, a piece of the tomb. And so when they talk about that, there is this power of belief, talking about like I found accounts where people said that they took flowers or they took tree branches or they took sprigs and they were hoping that they could go home and plant them and they would grow. I mean, the kind of stuff that you're just kind of like today, we're like, well, that's never going to work. But like they're talking about it and they're sending these letters home and describing what they're sending home, and they tell their family members to put it in water. I mean, it's really interesting because, I think we would look at it much more skeptically, but in the 19th century, Washington had become such a looming figure. I mean, even though he's gone in 1799, he's never really gone. He's sort of always there, peering over everybody's shoulders. And in a way, all of his successors, they always see themselves being measured up to the first president. And then those are the shoes that they try to fill. And I think Monroe certainly felt that way as well. Even though him and Washington had their issues and disagreements at the end, I think there was a respect there. And I think Monroe saw himself as that extension of Washington, that he could be that leader. So, I think it's really interesting to see how individuals interact with that memory, but also then how groups do it, and especially on site at Mount Vernon, because what people do at the tomb is very different than like what people do on Washington's birthday in Alexandria, right? It's a very different behavior, very different observations. It really helps you understand a little bit more about how people understood history in the 19th century.
You mentioned Alexandria, and that gives me a nice segue to another question that involves the point at when Washington died. Monroe was governor of Virginia, and the question was whether Monroe did anything to acknowledge the death of Washington. Did he issue a proclamation or anything of that nature? And I was looking for it. I could not find the proclamation itself fast enough, but Monroe as governor did issue a mourning proclamation. He marched in Alexandria with the rest of his gubernatorial administration, as well as militia officers and others, wearing a black armband and mourning. And it was ironic because Washington and Monroe had been close during the Revolutionary War. Monroe had been wounded, as we said, at Battle of Trenton. Washington commended him for that. As they became political figures, they diverged, and Monroe's mission to France, sent there by Washington, ended in perceived disgrace and animosity with the president. And he wrote a long diatribe against him that got Washington very angry. He filled it with liner notes. And even at his deathbed, Tobias Lear, as you know, the aide to Washington who was there, is trying to read the newspapers to him. They're reading about Monroe being made governor, and it gets
he gets a little flustered when he hears that, doesn't he?
Asperity. I think he reacted with asperity. But even at that point, Washington, I think, is still myth that Monroe had not come by the wisdom. Monroe is still feeling a bit distant. But Monroe, I think, does memorialize Washington a number of times later, and also, again, unconsciously, in the way that he adopts almost the dress, the mannerisms. The presidential tours he did were very much an emulation of what Washington had done, and just on a bigger scale, and even elements of the Monroe Doctrine, the part that talks about not only keeping Europe out of this continent, but not getting involved in the European affairs. That's very much an extension of Washington's advice in his final address. Jared, I wanted to play off of this in terms of the objects and what Matt's talking about, the popularity of Washington and the enduring popularity. And I'm thinking back to pieces in the James Monroe collection, including some that we exhibited a number of years ago during a political memorabilia exhibit. And I'm thinking especially of a English creamware pitcher that we have that has James Monroe identified on one side, but it's a terrible likeness. And he's wearing a military uniform. And then the other side has Washington, I think, either ascending into heaven or it's Washington's tomb. And I think it was a reworked Washington souvenir piece that they just rebranded from Monroe. But can you talk a bit about the degree to which some of the things that have come down in our collection, particularly where they pertain to the presidents, are often very much sort of memorial or almost relic objects about their legacies?
Yeah, and you're right. That one it's an early example of transfer wear. on pottery, where they, and because of the nature of transferware, there's a very good chance that you're correct, that they just basically reworked a earlier commemoration and then just, put Monroe's name on there. And I will say, I actually, speak to your point, what you've both been talking about. I do have some words that Monroe said in his message to Congress on May 2nd, 1822. And this speaks to what we're talking about. He says, a deportment, he's talking about Washington, a deportment so firm, so dignified, so exalted, yet so modest and composed, I have never seen in any other person. And I take him at his word on that. And the reason I say that is because, if you think about it, when during the Revolution, when he knew, Washington, and he was familiar with him, he was a young fellow then, and his father had passed. I'm not saying that Washington was a father figure to him necessarily, but I think definitely a role model in many ways. And if you look at what he's saying here, so exalted yet so modest, that is really interesting to me, because a lot of the pieces that we have here in the collection confirm this exact style. So when he's saying, we have, and I wish you all could come down to the museum and see this, the physical outfits that he has. And I won't turn the camera over there, but I have one sitting right over here that is literally exactly that. It's exalted yet modest. It's well done. I'm talking about a court suit that we have. Mm-hmm. So I think that in many ways he sort of modeled his style or his look after what he saw in Washington in those early days. And and Dr. Costello, I don't know if you get that sense at all, or.
Yeah, I think definitely when I'm thinking about sort of the stuff that I've come across with the White House, I mean, you keep in mind that, it was Washington who really was the one micromanaging and overseeing the initial construction of the White House. Even though he spent most of his time in Philadelphia, I mean, he stayed on the commissioners, and he was a taskmaster. And so, for him to be essentially overseeing the building of what would become the house of the chief executive, and he never actually lives there. I mean, it is the house that George Washington envisioned that the American president would live in. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, the White House is burned during the War of 1812. Congress votes to keep the Capitol there and to appropriate money to rebuild it. But that's really sort of how James Madison's administration ends, as while the White House is still under construction. And it's early on in the Monroe administration. Yes, he's off on his tour, but Monroe actually he's very similar with, by then it's the Commissioner of Public Buildings, Samuel Lane, really taking him to task about when are things going to get done, paying for things, bringing things in. So in many ways, you kind of, when you read the exchanges, there's almost some similarities between sort of how I think Monroe and Washington, they were administrators. I mean, they knew how to delegate, they knew how to put people to work. And you can see some of that even with the rebuilding of the White House, with Washington, the original construction, and Monroe finishing the second reconstruction.
Matt, getting back to some of the work that you've done in researching and writing on this, was there anything that you found in your research that shocked or surprised you about how much Washington and Monroe and other presidents did receive this veneration? I mean, did you have any preconceived notion that you found a different result to as you got into the research, or anything like that?
So the real impetus of this entire project, it started as a seminar paper in graduate school, and it focused much more specifically on the 1832 centennial. And what I learned then was that there were different efforts to memorialize Washington, move Washington, but I didn't know that there were actually plans, that there was, they wanted to put a tomb beneath the rotunda for George Washington's body. So that, to me, that was really surprising. The real irony of all of that is that if you go to the Capitol, it's an empty space. And for most of the 19th century, it was used for storage. And after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, it was used primarily for the Lincoln catafalque. So even though Washington wasn't buried there, it still ended up being used as a repository of sorts for things related to not only Lincoln, but then, in moving forward, any heads of state, members of Congress, anybody who was designated with the honor to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, that was the funeral bier that they used. So even though it doesn't get used for its design purpose, in a way, it's sort of, I think it sort of resembles this idea of how Americans really wanted to hero worship the body, but it also it went against everything sort of the revolution was based on, right? I mean, that empty tomb, I think, really symbolizes how American hero worship is sort of this duality of, we want to focus on one thing, but we can't quite do it.
We know Christ's tomb ended up being empty too. And if we want to keep going with the religious iconography, we could probably do so. I will say too, that I think that in the 19th century, as they had for eons before, and really this only changed probably in the later 19th, early 20th century, people on the whole lived a lot closer to death in their daily lives, in their family lives, than we generally do today. When someone dies in a family today, medical personnel, undertakers, all sort of come in, and professionals manage the process. In the homes of the high and the mighty and the lowborn of the 19th century or the 18th century, the families washed and prepared the bodies. They dressed them in whatever they were going to finally be in. They gathered all the generations around the coffin. Later on, farming families in the Midwest in the 1890s would have all the people there together, their tractors, their horses, all the things they were proud of, and there was the corpse in the middle. And even in growing up in my youth in the country, the Shenandoah Valley, it was a absolute requirement of any family funeral to ensure that somebody went and took Polaroids of the deceased and passed them around later. So I think that being interested in and close to death and to the deceased didn't repel people in some ways as much, or was not as alien to them as it might be today in some respects. And I know that, as you say, with Washington, and it's this way with Monroe's exhumation, with the moving of Lincoln's tomb, huge newspaper coverage, fascination with what did he look like? What condition was he in at this point? And got a lot of coverage.
Yeah, and it's interesting because these are sort of the big names we think of, right? We think of Washington, we think of Lincoln, we think of Monroe is actually it's an especially interesting story because a lot of these times these removals don't actually happen. There's just a lot of talk, there's a debate, and then eventually like one side just says they're not interested anymore and everybody just kind of drops it. But then there are other presidents where there have not only been successful removals, but then there's also more recently a question of where they're buried. So the one I'm thinking of is James K. Polk. Polk was originally buried at Polk Place in Nashville. Then he was moved to the state capitol. And then I think more recently, the James K. Polk home in Columbia was making a case for moving him from the Capitol back to Columbia, which was the house that his parents owned. So I mean, even today, like it's still one of these things where, depending on the figure in question, there is some interest and some debate about moving someone, and you could certainly argue that maybe it's about historic preservation, maybe it's about tourism, maybe it's about all these things. So there usually isn't one single reason, but it's very unusual because up until the Civil War, I mean, really the only sort of national cemetery that the United States had was congressional. And even then, most people were just sort of buried there until they were moved back to their home states, right? I mean, that's how Americans have generally died. I mean, they're buried in their home states. And so Arlington Cemetery changes that. But even now, former presidents tend to be buried either at their presidential libraries or their home states.
Probably Woodrow Wilson being one of the last ones that wasn't part of that pattern, right? I mean, he's buried in the district, is he not? So he's the only one, I believe, in the District of Columbia. Kennedy and William Howard Taft are at Arlington National Cemetery. But when you look at the modern presidents, most of them are at their presidential libraries. The exception is, Kennedy's at Arlington, LBJ's at the LBJ Ranch. But Hoover, Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon. I mean, all of these
all these presidents. That, I mean, that's become the new thing. And you know what, when you think about it, it makes sense, because the presidential library, you could argue, I mean, that's sort of the ultimate monument to a president, isn't it? I mean, between the archives, the objects, the photographs, the records of an administration, I mean, that is so much of their legacy. It makes sense that so many of them decide that that's where they want to be buried.
I lost you there for a few seconds, so I'm sure it was a wonderful pithy comment. I'll have to look at the recording.
I was going to say, let me just tell you, it was great, and so we can move forward. Yeah, there we go.
And permit me the observation too that they do a great job there at the James K. Polk Home and Museum, which is run right now. The interim director is a former intern of the James Monroe Museum, Candace Rowland Candido. So we're very proud of them, and we've collaborated with them too on programming. I know we got to worry about bumping too far ahead of our hour. We're already a bit over it, but I want to be sure. One question here was how were Monroe's remains transferred all the way from New York to Richmond? Read the August e-newsletter of the James Monroe Museum and you'll get that story, but it's not quite planes, trains, and automobiles, but it's definitely a couple of modes of transportation. And it is an interesting story in its own right. And actually, based on some of the things you were saying, almost immediately after Monroe's death, there was a move to try and think about getting him to Virginia, but it took that 27 years roughly to sort out how that would finally be affected. And then why is John Adams, for instance, buried in a church versus a more monumental spot like Washington or Monroe?
That is an excellent question. Unfortunately, I did not prepare that part of the talk about John Adams. But unless maybe you have an answer, maybe you can enlighten me, Scott.
No, I can't.
Oh, okay.
On the question.
I mean, I would, because I know that there's a family crypt at that church. So Adams, John and Abigail are there. I think John Quincy Adams is there. So to me, that would seem to suggest that was a family decision for them all to be buried there. And once one went, then they all followed suit. I mean, that was common because, usually you purchase these things that, it's a family investment, if that makes sense. It's kind of like you're buying property, and I guess property for eternity. And that's where the patriarch and the matriarch will end up. And then typically, that's where the children end up as well.
Yeah. Our last question, which I'm not entirely sure, I suspect it's aimed about Monroe. What about his wife, his daughters, where were they buried? And if it is in fact Monroe, the Monroe family is a little spread out. Elizabeth Monroe, who had died the year before James Monroe and really contributed to the debilitation he suffered in his last year, the grief as well as the physical debilitation. She and their daughter Mariah Hester Monroe Gouverneur eventually both joined James Monroe at Hollywood Cemetery, buried around the tomb of the president within the monument there, the birdcage or cathedral. The other daughter, Eliza Monroe Hay, whose husband died right around the same time as Elizabeth Monroe, causing double grief for James Monroe and for the family. Eliza went to France and died there after her other relatives, and is buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. So they were never fully reunited in death, and that is where they have remains. And the James Monroe Museum, through some very dedicated volunteers, we've been able to put an appropriate marker on the grave of Eliza Monroe and to try and put it in more presentable condition. It kind of been forgotten. So that memorialization, we take a hand in that, even to the children of President Monroe. Matthew Costello, White House Historical Association, thank you so much. Once again, it's a twofer for us having you in our programming this year, and we really appreciate it. Jared, Kearney, excellent job as usual. You can catch all of Jared's Curator Corners and or chats with the curator and other programs that the James Monroe Museum does, and our other university museum, Gary Melcher's Home and Studio, on their respective YouTube channels. This program will be archived on that. We thank Lindsay Crawford I got to think about that for a minute, for running the board for us tonight. It's been a long day. As always, we thank our audience for tuning in. Have a wonderful evening from the James Monroe Museum.
And I'm ending it